This portion of the program is two presentations by two distinguished Puerto Rican personalities. Maria de Lourdes Santiago, member of the Puerto Rican Senate and former candidate for governor, represented the Puerto Rican Pro-Independence Party. And Rafael Bernabe, like somebody say my long-lost brother, but not really. Professor of Hispanic Studies at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, and former candidate for governor, representing the Puerto Rican Working People's Party. They are going to address their talks on the title of the conference, Puerto Rico, Savage Neoliberalism, Colonialism, and Financial Despotism. The two moderators are the two professors that have been in the organizing committee for this event, Professor Roberto Alejandro from Political Science and Agustin Lao Montes from Sociology. Leave you with them.
Welcome to all of you to this important event. My colleague Agustin Lao told me that because he spoke at the beginning of the conference at 1:30, and then he also spoke here during the panels that I had. Honoring the American principle of fairness, I was under the obligation of delivering some remarks by way of introduction. So I'm going to oblige, even though I don't have any intention of competing with my colleague Agustin Lao. Historically speaking, Puerto Rico is a very young nation, and it is clear that our history has been aggravated by our conditions, subjectivities through colonial domination. But since it is almost impossible to envision power without resistance, there are important exceptions represented by movements and persons who have been able to challenge and withstand the onslaught of imperial designs and construct identities to support alternative views of reality. This conference is honored to have vibrant embodiments of the new subjectivities that reflection and political action make possible. Today, right now, Puerto Rico is enduring and living through what is probably its darkest hour in the last 70 years. The transparency of the savagery of neoliberal policies is almost blinding. For more than 2 decades, and for me this is deeply discomforting and disturbing because we in Puerto Rico tend to mobilize when pensions are cut or when salaries are reduced. But for me there are other problems that are probably deeper, and apparently they don't mobilize the sensibility of citizens of the island. For more than 2 decades now, the island has been a killing field for young adults. Yes. With 700, 800, and even 900 murders on an annual basis. Even during the time of El Rosellato, and the governor was bailing La Macarena, and thousands of people were dying. We haven't seen a massive march of citizens showing at least a sensibility toward these victims. For more than 2 decades now, more than 1 million people depend directly on a federal program of nutritional assistance under the symbolic name of PAM, which is one of the rallying cries of the Popular Democratic Party in Puerto Rico. PAM means a Programa de Asistencia Nutricional. And you know what the meaning of PAN is in Spanish. So basically one of the rallying cries of the colonial architect of the colonial establishment now is a federal program. While young Puerto Ricans have died by the thousands, other thousands have gone to the airport. and become part of a large diaspora. And today we were very honored to have Manuel Albelo, the son of a dear friend of mine, Ricardo Albelo, to talk very eloquently about the prospects and all the potentialities embedded in the Puerto Rican diaspora. This disheartening landscape has a bright point. The colonial status was dying for many years and kept dying. With the formal imposition of the Federal Financial Board, la Junta, Washington officially certified the demise of its creature. Today, a guy by the name Jeff Sessions, from a state that allegedly is part of the Union, from Alabama, wants the colonial establishment to apply makeup to this dead and rotting body and to include it as one of the options for the plebiscite in June. For those of you who have been paying attention to the news, Jeff Sessions said that the rotting corpse of El Estado Libre Asociado, the mummified reality of colonialism, should be represented, should be dragged in the middle of the day and be part of the plebiscite options. So we have a juridical death and an economic death. This is aggravated by the profound impoverishment of the analytical categories of capitalism in general and of neoliberal policies in particular. Capitalism glorifies pluralism and diversity. But in the economic domain, this is what the British call rubbish. And the Americans, always more efficient in language, refers to by using only 2 letters. In reality, neoliberalism has one recipe, and only one, that it applies with consistent indifference to the particularities of the countries it seeks to victimize. From Brazil to Argentina, from Greece to Puerto Rico, it is always the same prescription. Privatization, removal of regulation, austerity, punishing policies against workers' organizations, which are described as labor costs. And then the exclusion of political deliberations. The universal formula that is summoned to treat economic problems is joined to the claim that experts, not citizens, should be the only voices, and that economic and financial debacles are technical issues that are located outside the arena of democratic deliberations. This is just a technical issue. Only the experts are allowed to discuss it. For our last panel, we had 2 living and robust testimonies of the new Puerto Rico that is alive and well. We have Professor Rafael Bernabe, Professor of Hispanic Studies at the University of Puerto Rico, and Maria de Lourdes Santiago, both militants with moral backbones, symbols of resistance and dignity. My colleague Agustin Lau will present Professor Bernabe. Let me say a few words about Maria de Lourdes. Maria de Lourdes Santiago is one of the most distinguished political leaders on the political scene in Puerto Rico today. In this moment of poor erosion of public schools, it is worth mentioning that she is the product of public education. She went to public school in her hometown, Junta, and then moved to complete a bachelor's degree in drama before turning her attention to law. All her degrees in higher education are from the University of Puerto Rico at the main campus in Rio Piedras. She's very young, but when she was still younger, she began her political militancy in the pro-independence Puerto Rican party, where through her merits and hard work, she rose to become vice president. In the early 2000s, she participated in acts of civil disobedience against the presence of the American Navy in Vieques. The federal authorities were not pleased, and she spent 1 month in federal prison on the island. She has served 2 terms as senator, and this past November she ran for the position of governor in representation of the pre-independence parish. Personally, I feel that to be a senator in Puerto Rico surrounded by the known entities requires a special portion of stamina. She's the first woman to be candidate for governor in representation of the pre-independence option in Puerto Rico. Maria de Lourdes has demonstrated a consistent trajectory on behalf of education and on behalf of the environment and against colonialism. It is a pleasure to have both Professor Rafael Bernabe and Maria de Lourdes with us today. It is also my pleasure to introduce Maria de Lourdes to you.
Muy buenas tardes. I'd like to thank the organizers for this invitation to this conference and to this panel, the panel of politicians. Y gracias a Roberto por la gentileza de tus palabras. Many years ago, when I began in politics, I read somewhere that politics is, or should be, the art of transforming reality. But too often, politics acts as a sophisticated parlor trick to hide or to distort reality. Puerto Rico is a textbook example of this less noble undertaking of politics. And I would like to speak today how the crisis we are currently facing is an urgent call to accept our reality, that of a Latin American and Caribbean nation maimed by colonialism, and also the reality of the United States as a country that in 2017 still exerts its imperial power over a nation that has unmistakably repudiated the existing territorial relation. July 25th marks the Catholic festivity of Santiago Apostol, an important part of our Spanish heritage, now a minor folkloric celebration. It was on 1898, the date selected for the invasion of Puerto Rico, an invasion that served no military purpose, as the outcome of the Spanish-American War was already decided. But it was of utmost importance for the budding empire to make a grand entrance to the territory so intensely coveted for its geopolitical value. Weeks before, Theodore Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary to the Navy, had written to his friend and collaborator, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, "Do not make peace until we get Puerto Rico." Lodge's reply, "Puerto Rico is not forgotten and we mean to have it." Thus began the colonial experiment of United States in Puerto Rico, which eventually led to our islands being paraded as the showcase for American democracy, hiding under the disguise of benevolent intervention, a rapacious policy of political dominance and economic disposition. The American promise, as proclaimed by General Miles 4 days after the invasion, was, quote, "to bring you protection, not only to yourselves but to your property, to promote your prosperity, and to give the advantages and blessings of enlightened civilization." That's the military version of white man's burden. Well, to put it mildly, that promise has not been fulfilled. After 119 years under American rule, Puerto Rico holds the highest rate of inequality under American flag, according to the Gini coefficient, and the lowest rate of participation in the workforce, a mere 40% of the population. About 20% of the home mortgages in Puerto Rico are in risk of foreclosure. Petitions for bankruptcy and levels of personal indebtedness have been both in the rise for years. No wonder then that 250,000 people have left the islands in the last decade, leaving an aging and impoverished nation. The unpayable public debt is estimated in $72 billion. Public inefficient monopolies of essential services are responsible for most of the debt increase. That would be PREPA, the Power Out Company, and PRASA, la AAA, Water and Sewage Administration. Teachers in public schools must do without textbooks or materials in crowded rooms in which almost 39% of the students are registered in the special education program. 300 schools will be closed in the following years. Pension funds for public employees will run out by 2019. Health services are in peril, not only for lack of funds, but for the exodus of hundreds of healthcare professionals fleeing to the United States to escape the unregulated dictatorship of health plans. How did this happen is nowadays a frequent question. The answer is very simple. The crisis is the only possible and clearly foreseeable result of colonial rule. What we are suffering, and the world is witnessing, is the failure of the colonial experiment of the United States in Puerto Rico. One of the first measures imposed by the US and the beginning of the myth of common currency was the devaluation in of the Spanish peso, and instant decapitalization by decree that paved the way for the acquisition of great extensions of land by American corporations, and the development of the sugar and tobacco industries dominated by absenteeism and sustained by inhumane labor conditions. Reality turned out to be was that the United States, as declared by Pedro Albizu Campos, founder of the modern pro-independence movement, was interested in the cage, not the birds. But these conditions brought two undesirable elements to the colonial experiment. First, the kind of discontent that brought sympathy to Albizu's preaching about the connection between the economic oppression and the political regime. And second, they inhibited the development of a healthy market for United States products. You cannot have New York prices with underdeveloped salaries. Around that time began the definitive drafting of the script to be followed in the staging of the colonial drama, that alternative reality in which we are still waiting. The economic support of the territory as an accepted cost of doing business and as an effective way of masquerading the impossibility of economic development in a system of political inferiority. That's the price of an empire. There was an increase in salaries, forced in part by the strike led by Albizu Campos. But something else happened. By 1934, 35% of the population received some kind of benefit from the Puerto Rico Emergency Reconstruction Administration, la legendaria PRERA. ¿Se acuerdan cuando nos decían, oye, ¿usted cree que esto es la PRERA que vienes a pedir? Next year, its complement and soon-to-be successor, the Puerto Rico Reconstruction Administration, the PRA, was administering a $50 million annual budget when the annual budget administered by the Puerto Rican legislature was only $9 million. Federal assistance became the real ruler in Puerto Rico. This is a pivotal point because at that time began the masterful mythification of colonial subordination, a new stage of the colonial experiment, that of social material pacification. The instinctive need of our people, of every people on earth, for freedom, independence, self-sufficiency, was obliterated by the satisfaction of the most urgent material needs so efficiently provided by the American government. Any opposition to the myth of colonialism as the only way to achieve social justice would be deemed an attack on the hand that was feeding the country. Not by coincidence, this was also the beginning of the era of the cruelest repression of the independentista movement, and also of the implementation of a thoroughly designed colonial identity, the inception of a collective sense of inferiority, the nurturing of individual dependence on economic assistance from the United States government, the copy and paste of American institutions, and of course, in 1952, the birth of the Frankensteinian child of colonialism, the Estado Libre Asociado, deceitfully translated as Commonwealth. The leader of the Partido Popular, Luis Muñoz Marín, aptly characterized by Pablo Neruda as the minion of the American whiskey, chofer del whisky americano, became then the key figure for the transfiguration of every colonial vice into a national virtue. To understand Puerto Rico, for those here who are not Puerto Ricans, you must bear in mind that colonialism operates as a psychological ambush. It's the collective expression of the Stockholm Syndrome. Or, if you will, think of it as the Matrix, you know, Keanu Reeves. where humans are victims of a computer simulation designed to fool their minds into believing that they are living a full life, when in reality they are in prison, their bodies used as a source for energy for their captors, and the small minority that resists is haunted by agents wearing dark glasses. The stage was also set for the making of Puerto Rico an ideal laboratory for neoliberal practices long before the term became fashionable. It can be said that for the young empire, the Caribbean colony was conceived as a shrine to the trilogy of evil that gives its name to this conference: savage neoliberalism, colonialism, and financial despotism. And here I would like to point out that the use of our land and our people as subjects for experimentation goes far beyond the metaphorical. Thousands of Puerto Rican women were sterilized without their consent as a population control method. Agent Orange was tested in a Yunque rainforest. The island municipalities of Vieques and Culebra endured for 60 years the bombardment with live ordnance by the US Navy, and today, corporations like Bayer Monsanto, Pioneer, Dow, and Syngenta benefit from the concession of generous extensions of public land and even more generous incentives, $520 million in less than a decade, for their experiment with genetically modified organisms. These incentives actually are one of the decades-old neoliberal practices whose failings are clearly documented but still remain unaddressed, and that reach its highest point with the tax-sparing arrangements for capital-intensive U.S. companies provided by Section 936 of the U.S. Internal Revenue Code, the poster child of neoliberalism acting in a colonial context. Not only it proved to be a perfect vessel for the unequal distribution of social responsibilities, but it also provided an abnormally fertile ground for the pharmaceutical companies that were its main beneficiaries, thus provoking one of the principal vulnerabilities of the colonial economic system. 70% of all exports in Puerto Rico belong to the pharmaceutical and chemical industries. Neoliberal policies acted in close connection to one another, and then again being Puerto Rico a colony, with the prioritization of the interests of the American capital. Thus, the wealth generated by Section 936 not only failed to jumpstart economic development, but actually helped generate some of the conditions related in one way or another to the present crisis, For example, the unwise investments in construction, aided by too willing to lend mortgage banks, banks that profited from 936 deposits, elements that ushered the increase in price of real estate. The inevitable fall of the construction industry was then cushioned by a succession of incentives for the acquisition of homes and the building of hotels. Because that's the real business in Puerto Rico. It's not operating a hotel, it's building the hotel. Aimed at the socialization of the private sector losses. This is one of the ways in which the colonial government has willingly played the role of a confused Robin Hood, stealing from the poor to give to the rich. Puerto Rico has been led to believe that there is no life worth living outside the protection of the American flag. That's the colonial matrix. The reality is that the more Puerto Rico has adhered to the rules dictated by the United States, the worse its situation has been, and that's something to reflect about now that we're under the reign of the Fiscal Control Board. These are the numbers. In 1970, federal transfers equaled 7% of the gross national product, and that year, real economic growth reached 7%. Fast forward 45 years, 2015, and the same transfers had rocketed to 24.4% of the gross national product. The rate of economic growth, negative 0.6%. And even during the heyday of Section 936, on the 70s began the unstoppable fall. Economic growth had declined to 2% in the 80s. Still, during the same period, capital yields remitted to the exterior went from 593 million, that's 1970, to almost $36,000 million last year. But as a result of a completely dysfunctional tax system, tax revenues fell from 10.1 to 8.3, a completely abnormal buoyancy rate. What is a country to do in such a dire situation? If that country is a colony, there isn't much to do. Bankruptcy law is preempted by the federal government. That means we have no power whatsoever to restructure our debt or that of our public corporations and municipalities. Neither can we request international financial aid. And that's not the worst part, because, and this is really important, the debt is nothing but a symptom of the real malaise, the impossibility of economic growth under a system of political inferiority. There's nothing we can do under American rule to put a stop to the known, to the acknowledged drivers of economic decline. We are bounded by the Interstate Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, which makes it illegal for us the adoption of any protectionist measures to counter, for example, the adverse effects in the local economy of megastores or of the tariff imposed in raw materials needed by local manufacturers. The imposition of the United States cabotage laws forces us to depend on the expensive United States merchant marine for the transportation of consumer goods coming from any point in the US. That means that a country in which 45% of the people are under the level of poverty is forced to subsidize a completely outdated shipping policy whose benefits, even to the United States, are seriously questioned. In a world economy woven around international agreements, we cannot enter in any agreement with any other nation without express US approval, even when privileged access to US markets, arguably one of the highlights of our colonial relationship, was lost a long time ago. Even environmental matters, you all have heard about peñuelas, like the current controversy about the disposition of coal ashes, is subject not only to insufficient federal standards, but to overt extralegislative congressional intervention in the defense of American economic interests. It must be clear to everyone that economic development is nothing but a pretension incompatible with colonial reality, as the independentistas have warned for decades. Still, the United States to the crisis could not have been more myopic and ill-directed, applying to a crisis created by colonialism the highest possible dose of colonialism, la Junta de Control Fiscal. 7 US government-appointed persons with absolute power over my country, including veto power. We are, legally and politically speaking, worse off than a century ago, when the Chamber of Delegates, then the only elected members of the government, actually had a say in government matters. Paradoxically, in order to lay the legal grounds for the imposition of the Fiscal Control Board, the US government had to lay out in the open the true nature of the territorial relation a couple of hours before the debate on Promesa began on the House of Representatives, and that's no coincidence. The United States Supreme Court issued its judgment in the case of Puerto Rico versus Sanchez Valle, concurring with Obama's administration stance. It was held that the powers exercised by the government of Puerto Rico exist and can only be exercised as delegated by Congress, which is in all governmental matters the ultimate source of power. It was Congress who conferred the authority to create the Puerto Rico Constitution, stated the court, and even more important, quote, "One power Congress does not have, just in the nature of things, the capacity, no magic wand or airbrush, to erase or otherwise rewrite its own foundational role in conferring political authority," end of quote. This is the dismantlement of the idea of present or future sovereignty under the territorial status. Someone has to tell Jeff Sessions. For saying things like this, the independentista movement has been penalized, persecuted. Now, Sanchez Valle has made it acceptable to say in polite company that the emperor is naked and he is such an ugly sight. Now, the board is doing exactly what Professor Bernabe and I repeated and repeated and repeated as candidates for governor. Extract from our country whatever is left in order to appease the American creditors, including the Vulture Fund, that knowingly acquire triple-exempt bonds from a government in clear route to insolvency. Because you can rest assured that if the only ones dealing with Puerto Rico's default were small Puerto Rican investors or Puerto Rican cooperatives, the Fiscal Control Board would have never come to existence. The measures imposed by the Control Board have already encountered strong resistance. Women took the streets on March 8th. Students of the University of Puerto Rico are currently on strike with an unprecedented approval. Even the government has had to perform the good cop, bad cop sketch in its public relation with the board in order to maintain some credibility. But Puerto Rico has reached the point of no return, and the current situation can be summed up as this. First, the United States, through its creative statesmanship, devised a colonial system unique in some way, but like every colonial system, unable to thrive. Puerto Rico is broke because that was the only possible outcome of United States colonial policy. Second, after 119 years of American colonialism, we are not American and we don't want to be Americans. For more on this, hashtag Team Rubio. Third, the loss of our military geopolitical importance, the disappearance of tax sparing arrangements, and the collapse of the bond market have greatly diminished Puerto Rico's appeal to the United States. Fourth, 54% of the voters demanded in the 2012 referendum the end of the territorial condition of Puerto Rico. 5, the public debt is not difficult to pay. The public debt is unpayable. It is unpayable. And the austerity measures to be imposed by the junta will only accelerate what has been called a humanitarian crisis, but even more. they will have a long-lasting effect in the possibility of economic recovery. 6. By depicting independence as the recipe for isolation and poverty, and by fostering dependence through personal and corporate welfare, the United States has promoted the growth of the annexation movement. In the Partido Independentista, we used to call the era el semillero de estadista. And might eventually face a statehood petition driven by the widespread notion that statehood represents an endless cornucopia of federal funds. 7. Although there is a clear consensus about the convenience of having the tools for economic development that can only be provided by sovereignty, like not being bound by cabotage laws or the interstate commerce clause, a fair offer of sovereignty is needed to make this option palatable to most people. And last, the lack of resolution of Puerto Rico's status prevents the undertaking of any coherent strategy, even to tackle minor issues, as political forces are and will be defined by status preferences, which prevents any other kind of political alignment in the island. On June 11th, there will be a plebiscite in Puerto Rico. The ballot reflects the two options for the U.S. to dispose of its territory. Well, I wrote this before. As Roberto said, Jeff Sessions issued a statement. Apparently, well, we don't know. We don't have his own statement. These are the tweeters by Rosselló's tweeters that say that the government will oppose the intervention of the Department of Justice. We'll see to that. But right now, the ballot reflects the two options for the U.S. to dispose of its territory. First, integration as part of the U.S. Federation, or, that's the second option, the circle, a sovereign nation as part of a free association treaty with the United States or as an independent state. For us independentistas, it represents the fulfillment of Albizu Campos' prophecy. Llegará el momento de la suprema definición, o yanquis o puertorriqueños. The moment will come for the supreme definitions, Yankees or Puerto Ricans. Should the option for sovereignty prevail, a referendum will take place in October between the options of free association or independence. Should the option of a statehood win, the time will come for the United States to decide whether to annex a Caribbean nation with a distinct national identity, a different language, and an indefatigable independentista movement. This is the moment for the United States to rethink its policy regarding Puerto Rico. This is the moment when politics should be an instrument to change the colonial reality that is a burden to my country and a shame for this one. It is for me a shocking fact, a truly shocking fact, that in the United States, even those considered liberals or progressive remain heedless to the outrageous persistence of colonialism in Puerto Rico. We remain a colony because the United States remains unabashedly an empire. The problem of Puerto Rico's political future is not a civil rights problem. It is a matter of collective self-determination. And the inaction of the United States will only aggravate an already critical situation. We don't need privileges. We don't want the crumbs that fall from the table. No more white man's burden. What we want is a new relation that honors the dignity, identity, and interests of two neighboring nations. An amicable separation, a mutual consent divorce, a fair transition. I have no doubt whatsoever that soon the force of our nationality and the need to reshape the political and economic structures that have brought us to the present crossroads will prevail, and we shall have our future in our hands. Only then will Puerto Rican reality change for the best. Muchas gracias.
fiesta boricua defiende lo tuyo.
That's right.
Well, it's a hard act to follow the sharpness, the charisma, the leadership provided by your words. So my role here is to present Rafael Bernabe. But before doing so, I just want to say a couple of things. One is that I would like to recognize the role of Caroline Parker and the crew of people who has been working on this. I mean, the people behind the scenes which really make this possible. And we want to give a hand to Caroline Parker. I also want to say that it's a pleasure to work with Roberto Alejandro, who, is a legend in the Puerto Rican scene. I mean, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who's now is president of the Puerto Rican, of the American Sociological Association, it's not only Puerto Rican. When he came here and I said that Roberto was a professor here, he said, please tell Roberto to come say hello to me, because, his leadership of a strike that was national in 1981, that proved that student politics can become national politics in Puerto Rico is something that is alive in Puerto Rican memory. And from being a leader in the island and the diaspora, Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, I actually remember during that time I was active in the diaspora in support of the strike. He's become one of the most prominent political theorists, critical political theorists in the United States, and it's really a pleasure to work with him in organizing this and many of the things that are coming. I was thinking when Maria Lourdes was speaking, in the late Frank Bonilla, Beyond Survival, ¿por qué seguiremos siendo puertorriqueños? And I was thinking through the conference that had more than fulfilled our expectations of engaging these issues in a critical way, in a creative way, of Maurice Bishop when he was Prime Minister of Grenada, who said, a very famous phrase of Maurice Bishop, who said that when in the United States they have a cold, we get pneumonia in the Caribbean. And this is really a symptom what's happening in the island of a global crisis, and this is one which have a long history, and this is part of what we have been discussing here. But in the island of Puerto Rico, in the archipelago of Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican communities here in the United States, it's really a colonial crisis, a societal crisis, and it's a collapse of the colonial state. And we are then in a very critical historical moment where we collectively as a people have the possibility of constructing something new. And it's a moment in which the most vulnerable people, working class, women, people of color, black people, are facing most of the suffering from what are the consequences of crisis. So it's a moment of resistance and of possibilities of creating alternative futures, and this is what we are discussing here clearly. And in that note, I mean, and in this panel, we put it together not to talk about politicos in the traditional sense, but to have the wide kind of variety of what the Puerto Rican left in terms of political parties represented here. And one of the main voices in Puerto Rico for many years in the Puerto Rican left has been Rafael Bernabe, which I'm proud that we graduated from the same PhD program, which is, the Binghamton program. And I remember Teddy Hopkins Teddy Hopkins, is the one that we remember there. But he's not as known as Immanuel Wallerstein and Giovanni Arrighi, the great figures of the sociology program where we graduated. But Teddy, you know, who was actually the mastermind behind it, as Wallace and Arrighi say, was very proud that there is a crew of Puerto Ricans who graduated from there. No, Juan Yuti, Pancho Mocoso, and you know, of us Puerto Ricans who graduated from there, the one who really have arrived, not only as an important intellectual voice, because he has the book that is more well known in English is Puerto Rico in the American Century History since 1898, but Rafael Bernabe had published several books, many of which have been interventions, political interventions in very important moments, and as part of Taller de Formación Política has done work which has actually been intervening in the intellectual, political, public sphere for many years. The one who have become more of a public intellectual, radical public intellectual, has been Rafael Bernabe. I mean, remembering the Huelga de la Telefónica, the strike that was mentioned in 1998. He was the national voice then. He has been in the Vieques struggle, in many struggles, and has been the main leader of a really important political formation, which is the Puerto Ricans Workers' Party, Partido de los Trabajadores Puertorriqueños, which actually is not simply a workers' party in the traditional sense, but is actually a more coalitional workers' party like the PT in Brazil, the Workers' Party in Brazil, that it puts together a variety of ecological, feminist, anti-racist, community struggles, etc. So it's really a pleasure to have here Rafael Bernabe, who is intellectual of many different talents, and who is one of our main leaders, our main voices in the Puerto Rican left. Please welcome Rafael Bernabe.
Buenas tardes, buenas noches. I begin by thanking Agustin for these words and by thanking the organizers of this activity for inviting me and for making possible my presence here today. There are many, before I start, we have some copies of the presentation I'm going to read, so you may follow it as I read it. I wasn't sure my English was going to work as well as it did when I lived in the US many years ago. They are, let me wait till people get it so they can follow it. I can start by saying a few introductory remarks. The main one is that, of course, I'm not going to be able to address many aspects of the situation in Puerto Rico in my presentation, given the amount of time I have. I would be more than happy to address them in the discussion period if you want to. And as I said, in order to honor the time I have, I'm going to read the presentation so that I don't speak too much. So let me start. Isolating the situation in Puerto Rico is one of the mechanisms used to seek acceptance of the austerity policies that are now being imposed on the island. If the crisis, as some people argue, is the result of actions by Puerto Ricans or the Puerto Rican government, if the responsibility lies exclusively or fundamentally in Puerto Rico, then it is only fair that it bears the consequences of its own deeds or misdeeds, painful as they may be. To recognize that the crisis of indebtedness is a global phenomenon, that the debate over fiscal crisis and austerity policies spans the planet, suggests, on the contrary, that the crisis in Puerto Rico, with all its colonial particularities, is in fact not unique. This also suggests that the crisis has structural, systemic roots linked to the contradictions of the dominant economic order in its present stage. It cannot be attributed to some specifically Puerto Rican pathology. From this, two conclusions may follow. One, just as austerity policies are resisted elsewhere, we should not acquiesce to them in Puerto Rico. And two, we need to connect with the resistances elsewhere, including, of course, the United States. In this presentation, I examine the current debates in Puerto Rico using two concepts. The two concepts are punitive neoliberalism, and the second one is financial melancholia. I will explain what that means in a minute. Elaborated by several students of similar debates in Great Britain. I begin with some very general comments on two issues, unemployment and debt. Unemployment is a normal aspect of capitalism. During its recurrent recessions and depressions, unemployment increases above normal levels. In colonial and underdeveloped economies, such as Puerto Rico, unemployment is typically much higher, not only periodically, but chronically. In response to this reality, the reality of unemployment, and often thanks to labor and social reform movements, many governments, including the United States, have instituted programs that lessen the privations provoked by the lack of employment in a market economy. Nevertheless, we are all aware of the popularity of the notion that unemployment results from the fact that, quote, people don't want to work, and that welfare, that is to say, programs that compensate for no or low income, promote and reward laziness. According to this logic, the problem is laziness, not capitalism or colonial capitalism. The problem is the poor, not the system that impoverishes them. Welfare is the problem, not the system that does not generate employment. It would be hard to exaggerate the reach of this ideology that exonerates capitalism while blaming others, indeed blaming some of its victims for its consequences. This misrepresentation of reality is perfectly fitted for the reproduction of the existing social system, has penetrated all social sectors. Something similar happens in the case of debt, or over-indebtedness, and fiscal crisis. To put it very briefly, in its present epoch, capitalism cannot exist without very high levels of debt. For example, capital seeks to lower its tax burden and to freeze or cut real wages, yet it must increase its sales to individuals and to the state. The bridge between these two contradictory impulses is built on debt. Meanwhile, deregulation frees speculation with debt-based financial instruments, that some of the previous speakers spoke about this, which eventually led, among other things, to the great financial meltdown of 2008, at which point governments organized massive bailouts of their banking and financial sectors, for which they incurred new massive debts. This is the real source of the present fiscal crisis, globally speaking. Not excessive spending or overgenerous social programs, but 3 decades of corporate tax cuts, not fiscal excesses, but the cost of rescuing capital from its speculative irresponsibility and excesses. Yet, personal over-indebtedness is not attributed, when we hear people talking, it's not attributed to the dominant economic system, but to individual negligence. The system is not the problem, but rather individuals who have irresponsibly, as we often hear, lived beyond their means. Similarly, the fiscal crisis is blamed on excessive spending, high public sector wages, over-generous social programs, or subsidies. Capital is again exonerated. The source of the crisis is the irresponsibility of individuals or of government, not these policies imposed by capital over 3 decades. All of this has practical consequences. If welfare and a bloated public sector are considered to be the causes of unemployment and of the fiscal and debt crisis, then the solution must then consist of welfare and public spending cuts. This may be painful, we are told, but it is inevitable. Yet there is a discordant fact in all of this, a very discordant fact, which is that austerity policies do not function